Hello, everyone. Welcome here. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be discussing navigating SharePoint integration from seamless configuration to workflow automation. And I am joined by both Natalie and Matt as our presenters today. So I'll pass things over to Natalie to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so hi, welcome everybody. As Elizabeth said, my name is Natalie. I am a technical support specialist on the FME form support team here at Safe Software, and happy to be here to talk some SharePoint with you today.
Hi everyone, Matt Meebor. I'm also a technical support specialist on the FME flow side of the product.
Excellent. And I'll note we also have Bailey joining us on the back end. So if you have any questions during the webinar, just drop those in the questions tab on the bottom right. Keep letting us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. And we have a poll coming up shortly under the polls tab there. And then lastly, I'll just note if you have any audio or video issues, that help button on the bottom left has 4 simple steps. If you want to download the slides, you can do so with the top right button on the PDF here. All right, perfect. And I'll pass things over to Matt for our agenda. And also, before I do, I'll just ask if our presenters can turn off their webcams to save on some bandwidth for the remainder here.
For sure. All right, welcome again to our SharePoint webinar. So we'll have just a brief introduction to SharePoint and FME, and that'll be followed by what you need to know to connect from FME. We'll look at some real-world examples and follow that up with some troubleshooting. SharePoint can be a trickier system to integrate with, so there are some common issues you may run into, and we'll talk about some of those. And then we'll summarize things and have some time for questions. So I'll just pass it back to Elizabeth to kick off our poll.
Perfect. So I've published that now. I'll give everyone a moment. We'd like to know, what is your experience level with SharePoint? Are you familiar with SharePoint and FME? Maybe you've used both or only used FME or SharePoint. Or maybe you haven't yet gotten started. All right, looks like most votes have come in already. I've used both, but haven't integrated FME and SharePoint. You are in the right place. That seems to be about 70% of folks on the call today, and then another 20% familiar with both. Yeah, there'll be learnings for all levels today. Thanks, everyone.
For sure, yeah, that's great. We'll definitely be covering some things that'll probably be new to you if you have worked and integrated with SharePoint and FME integration before. We'll start at the beginning with some basics in case you haven't. So just to do a brief introduction here, how do you integrate data from SharePoint into your workflows and why? What are the challenges that you could face? So if you have SharePoint in your organization and you're attending this webinar, you probably have a need to get data out of it or perhaps write to it. Organizations have the need to seamlessly access data. So SharePoint might be one of the places to host and share important files within your org. Pretty much any file can be shared through a SharePoint document library, but since SharePoint's really designed to integrate with MS Office, it's part of the MS Office suite, you're most likely dealing with Excel spreadsheets or maybe some other documents, although people do try and store almost anything in SharePoint from what I've seen. Data may also be stored in lists of tabular data. Natalie will talk about the difference between those two. Automation, of course, so how can you read data from SharePoint into FME without manual intervention? And how can you update files in SharePoint? When do you need to? On schedule, when something changes, so we'll look at some of that. And you need to be able to resolve integration issues quickly. So some of the common challenges in addressing these needs are accessing SharePoint data outside of the SharePoint user interface can be challenging. So you need to understand web authentication methods, I should say, maybe maintain custom code, data access and manual processes exist. So SharePoint data may need to be joined with other data sets. There's lots of APIs involved in Microsoft Azure. There's a Graph API, SharePoint API, the issue of maintaining custom code and permissions. And so this is really where FME can help you get connected and start integrating with SharePoint and a whole lot more if you're relatively new to FME. which it seems like most of you are, so that's great. You'll know that we connect with hundreds of different formats, so you can join that SharePoint data with practically anything. And just a quick slide on the FME platform. If you haven't used the whole platform, we have FME Form, which is the authoring environment, which I suspect most of you have used. That's where you build your data integration workflows. And then we also have FME Flow, which lets you automate those workflows, do a whole lot more with them. That's a web application that can be deployed on-premise, in your private cloud, or via our fully hosted AWS cloud environment called FME Flow Hosted. So getting into some of the SharePoint integration, there's two primary ways to integrate with SharePoint. There's the SharePoint list reader and writer that lets you read SharePoint lists as feature types or tables for reading and writing tabular data. And then there's the SharePoint Online connector, and that lets you upload, download, list, and delete documents in SharePoint Online. And of course, once you've downloaded a document from SharePoint Online, you can use a feature reader to read that document data in. So let's kick things off with a quick flash demo. I'll just share my screen here. So what we have here is an ArcGIS Online web map with some construction sites, fictional construction sites, of course, as we'll see. These don't really exist. If I click on a point, we'll see a bunch of data about the site, including this latest update. So this is a project manager update. And if we hop over into SharePoint, we'll see we have a list here, construction sites list, which is a bunch of addresses and all of our company's construction sites. And then we have a progress reports document library. And these are Excel spreadsheets, for better or for worse. That's how this company's storing their information and are doing their progress report updates. So a project manager comes in here and they would put in a date, the % complete, and their visit observations. And this data needs to make its way onto our web maps to be shared with the public. And to do that, we're going to use FME, of course. We're going to read in the master list of sites from SharePoint, and then we're going to read in those progress reports, join that data together, and update ArcGIS Online. So I'm going to just run this in FME Workbench. And that'll take a moment for our list items and our documents to download. And we're going to join that data together, and we should see our web map updated. So if we go and look at the progress report that we updated, which was for our Marine Drive site, I believe. We click on that, we'll see our October 16th update. Walls are complete and roofing has started. And then the other information there is coming from the list. So just to give you an idea of how lists and libraries in SharePoint can be joined together using FME. So now I'd like to pass it to Natalie, who's going to talk about some key terms and integration methods.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, for the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the key concepts that are related to SharePoint integrations in FME. I'm going to keep these explanations pretty high level for brevity. However, each of the following slides are going to contain some blue links to relevant resources that you can consult as you see fit. So here we go. The first key term that I'd like to go over is the concept of a web service in FME, of course, in the context of SharePoint integrations. FME web services are built in FME Workbench by navigating to Tools, FME Options, Web Connections, Manage Services. So just keep that path in mind. Overall, the SharePoint web services in FME are designed for authorization with Microsoft Entra. They follow the OAuth 2.0 standard, specifically the authorization code grant flow with a refresh token, or the client credentials flow, depending on the FME web service that you're working with. And being OAuth 2.0 compliant, the whole purpose of these web services is to obtain and store an access token, which FME then uses to access your SharePoint resources. So configuring and testing the appropriate FME web service is the first step in building an FME web connection, and it's the connection that you then use on Canvas to reach out to your SharePoint resources. So web service is not a web connection. They're not interchangeable terms. Speaking of web connections, You can find your FME web connections in FME Workbench by navigating to Tools, FME Options, Web Connections, where you'll see a connections table which contains all of your FME web connections. And that's that top image that you see on screen here. A single FME web connection is built from a single web service, but one web service can be used to build many web connections. So they're a little recyclable. And as I mentioned before, an FME web connection is designed to present the acquired access token to the web service provider's resource server so that you can then go and access your SharePoint resources through FME. These FME web connections are the elements that you would be applying to your Canvas objects, like the SharePoint list reader or the SharePoint Online connector, not the web service directly. And the images that you're seeing on screen here are demonstrating two methods of building a web connection in FME Workbench. The top image shows you how to build one right from that connections table in FME Options. And the bottom image is showing you how to build a web connection right from the Canvas object itself. So you can go either way with this. And any web connections that you build right from the connector or the list format, those will appear in your connections table in FME Options. That way you can readily manage them as needed. So you may have heard me mention the term OAuth 2.0 previously. And given just how many of FME's web services are OAuth 2.0 compliant, it's handy to have just a very high-level understanding of this concept. So OAuth 2.0 is an authorization standard, where authorization is a process which helps answer the question, does this entity, does this user have permission to access the resource that they're requesting? So it's most concerned with access rights. OAuth 2.0 is not an authentication standard, where authentication is more concerned with verifying the identity of a user or a service. But a valid user session is required to complete some OAuth 2.0 flows or methods. So you may need to provide valid Microsoft username and password to authenticate FME's SharePoint web services. It just depends again on the web service that you're working with. And there are quite a few different flavors of OAuth 2.0, and these are called grant flows. But the two that apply to FME's SharePoint web services are the authorization code grant flow with a refresh token and the client credentials grant flow. I've linked more information about these two grant flows in the slide. Just note that client credentials is only supported for FME Form 2024.1. It's a new feature. And the whole idea of OAuth 2.0 is this use of access tokens instead of passwords to get at protected resources. And this is a much more secure way of accessing sensitive resources. And it is the current industry standard protocol for authorization. So you get that nice feature in FME. So keeping those concepts in mind, I'm now going to walk you through the main methods that we have for integrating with SharePoint in FME. I'm going to give an overview of the three bolded methods that you see on screen here, and I'm going to save the HTTP caller for a demonstration later in our presentation. I would encourage you to consult our Getting Started with Microsoft SharePoint knowledge base article linked at the top of the slide for more detailed descriptions of these methods. So let's start with the SharePoint list format that Matt mentioned before. So the SharePoint list reader and writer, it specifically targets list resources that are held in SharePoint Server 2013 Plus or Microsoft SharePoint Online, where a list is essentially data in tabular format. So it's rows and columns of information. We're not talking about necessarily standalone files here. And the list format is able to acquire list data by performing calls against the SharePoint API. And I've linked the SharePoint REST service documentation there for reference. So in order to make use of the SharePoint list reader or writer, you do require the configuration of the SharePoint Online template web service, shown in bold on this slide. This web service supports the authorization code grant flow only, so you do need a valid Microsoft username and password to authorize this web service. You're also going to need an Azure registered application with delegated SharePoint API permissions. So those are two important points to keep in mind about this one. The image at right on this is showing the value that the dataset parameter of the list reader is expecting to receive. It is looking for at least the URL of a target site. If you want to go a level deeper than the site level with this dataset parameter, I would encourage you to consult the linked SharePoint API documentation to see how that base URL should look, because it's a little bit different than perhaps what you're used to. So here's the web service, just a closer view of the web service that's required for the SharePoint list format. Again, this web service only supports the auth code grant flow, so you will need a valid Microsoft username and password to establish a valid user session and complete the OAuth flow. This web service definition also requires a few specific configuration steps to adjust the parameter values that you see therein. Instructions for configuring this web service are linked to our Getting Started with Microsoft SharePoint knowledge base article, so please be sure to consult that article for those specific instructions. So now we'll take a look at the next integration method, which is the SharePoint Online connector. The SharePoint Online connector is available as an FME package on FME Hub. So this means that this connector is an add-on to your FME platform, so something that needs to be installed in addition to your FME form and flow. You can see the SharePoint Online packages information page shown in the top image there on screen, and that's where you can download it directly from. Or you can just quick add it to your FME Workbench canvas, and that will prompt an install of the package as well. This connector comes as a transformer, not a reader or a writer, and it targets SharePoint document library resources that are held in a SharePoint Online environment, where a document library is more like a container for storing your files or folders. So this is where you'll actually see standalone files being stored, is in a document library. It makes calls against the Microsoft Graph API, and there's the Graph API endpoint reference linked in blue. Very helpful to get a little familiar with that reference if you're going to be using the SharePoint Online connector quite a bit. And to use this connector, you will need to configure one of the two bolded FME web services shown on this slide, just in that last major bullet point there. You would choose which web service to configure based on the OAuth 2.0 grant flow that you need to follow. If you have a valid Microsoft username and password, and your Azure registered app has delegated Graph API permissions, then you could configure the SharePoint Online safe.microsoft-SharePoint web service, so the top one shown there. If, however, you do not have a valid Microsoft username and password, or your Azure registered app has application Graph API permissions applied, then you would need to make use of the Microsoft Graph app-only web service, which again is new for FME Form 2024.1. It's just important to keep those two web services straight, because if you configure the wrong one or you use the wrong one, you will get OAuth errors showing up with testing your web service. Here's just a little closer look at those web services that I mentioned. The web service on the left is the one that supports the authorization code grant flow, and again, requires a valid username and password. And it does require some additional configuration steps. Instructions for those configuration steps for this web service are linked in the Getting Started with Microsoft SharePoint article that I've posted there. You're going to hear me say that article a lot. It's a good one to bookmark for SharePoint integrations. And then the web service on the right here supports the client credentials grant flow, and so does not require a valid username and password for authorization. There are no additional configuration steps needed for this web service. You can simply use it as is to build your web connection. But just to emphasize, this web service is only available as of FME Form 2024.1 and version 1.2.0 of the SharePoint Online Connectors package. So fairly recent support. Getting some thumbs up on that one. Good stuff. SharePoint as a web file system is the third integration method that I'm going to highlight here. And this one's kind of neat. So let me just, there we go. So This web file system method of accessing SharePoint resources is a feature of many of our readers and writers, so many of our formats. It's convenient to have a SharePoint integration method tied right to, say, our readers, because it allows you to take advantage of the additional functionality that the reader offers. Okay, so it's a neat way of doing things. You can see the method of accessing this functionality in the image shown on screen. So if the reader or format is going to offer this, it would be available under the drop-down arrow next to the dataset parameter. So you can see, just select the drop-down arrow and then select from web, and then you'll see an option for Browse Microsoft SharePoint. This functionality makes its calls against the Microsoft Graph API, so you can use the exact same web connection that you've configured for your SharePoint Online connector to take advantage of the web file system functionality. And generally speaking, this functionality will be available if the file type that you want to find in SharePoint, or the file type that you want to find, can be hosted in SharePoint Online, and FME has a format for that file type. And a good example is the Excel reader, and that's in fact what most people use to access this functionality, is through the Excel reader. Okay, so now I'm going to hand things back to Matt, and we're going to take a look at some real-world examples of integrating with SharePoint.
Great, thanks, Natalie. So the first thing we're going to do is build on our initial Flash demo and look at how we can make that a little more robust. We'll look at joining SharePoint data and detecting change. So we're going to take our construction progress reports example, which is syncing SharePoint to ArcGIS Online. And our goal here is, of course, to provide up-to-date construction project information on a web map. The blocker is SharePoint, that data is in SharePoint lists and libraries. Maybe not totally real world to have progress reports in Excel again, but does it happen? Yes. And this is a SharePoint webinar, so we wanted to focus on documents that would be stored in SharePoint. And data is changing. There's manual processes to synchronize it. And so our key here is to use FME to automate that workflow, of course. And we want to run on schedule to detect changes in SharePoint and make sure that our ArcGIS Online web map is kept up to date with the latest update. And the result is more accurate and timely data for consumers of that web map. And we can remove manual processes of taking the data out of SharePoint and manually updating ArcGIS Online. So I'll share my screen now. We'll do the demo. So here we have our ArcGIS Online web map again that we saw in the Flash demo. This is a map of fictional construction sites. And just to reiterate our SharePoint setup, we've got a construction site SharePoint list and a document library of progress reports. And the key to join these two is going to be our site ID. That's the unique ID used in both data sets. And so if we open up one of our progress reports again, we'll see that the data we want to show on our web map is the date of the last progress report update, the visit observations, and the % complete. So hopping over into our workspace here, the top part of our flow is dealing with our list. So we're reading in our SharePoint list using a SharePoint list reader here. And that's going to hit the SharePoint list on my site, and I've set up a web connection that Natalie was talking about for that. It's an OAuth 2 SharePoint web connection. And then we're reading in our sites, our existing sites that are on the map from ArcGIS Online. And we're going to use a transformer, some of you might have used, called the change detector. And we're going to look at the location field on our SharePoint list and the site ID, and let the change detector tell us what sites have been inserted or updated. Because we only want to geocode the new SharePoint list items or the newer updated locations. We don't want to spend money geocoding or time geocoding a bunch that have already been coded. So I'm going to run this up to the change detector, and we see we only have 10 sites. Most of them are unchanged, but we do see that the change detector has detected one has been inserted. So if I look in my visual preview, I can see that project is Oak Ridge Plaza, site 1029. So later when we look in ArcGIS Online, we're going to see that point get added to our map. Now this data is going to be joined and written out to ArcGIS Online with our progress report information. So let's look at the bottom half of our flow. We're going to use a few SharePoint connectors, online connectors. The first one is going to do a list operation on our SharePoint document library. And that's going to pull in, and that's using a graph connection using application permissions that Natalie talked about, I should mention. And this is going to pull in a bunch of document metadata. It's going to tell us when the document was last modified. It's going to give us that full path so that we can download only the modified documents. And we're going to do something a little different here. I'm actually going to save a snapshot of what the library looked like, the metadata, in a CSV file. It's very quick to read and write CSV in SharePoint. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can use another change detector to see what's changed since the workflow last ran. So I'm just saving that snapshot in CSV. I'm going to run this up to the change detector. And we see nothing has changed since the workflow last ran. But we're going to make some changes shortly. That'll trigger an update that we'll take a look at downstream. So that first SharePoint Online connector is going to feed the updated or inserted documents into another SharePoint Online connector so that we can take the attributes for the library name and the full path and do a download action. We only want to spend time, processing time, downloading the ones that have actually been changed or updated. And we're going to just download those to FME shared resource temp. That's a FME flow parameter. That's going to tell our workspace to just put them in a temp folder on FME flow, because we're eventually going to publish this and run it on flow. And I've got that temporarily in Workbench set to a location OIC drive. Now, once we've downloaded the changed reports, we need to use a feature reader to read them. So we're going to provide it with that download path. We'll read each Excel file. We'll do a little bit of testing just to make sure we don't have any null rows. And then to get the latest report, because each Excel file has multiple rows, I'm going to actually use an inline querier. And so I'm going to query my Excel data set and just get the row back with the latest date. There's probably a few different ways we could do this. I like the inline querier. And so then we'll take that latest progress report, join it to the site information, and update ArcGIS Online. We can actually do an upsert action there. So let's go make an update in our progress report like we did in our flash demo. We'll make a change to our Granville Residences site. We'll update our % complete to 30. And I'm just going to paste in some visit observations saying framing is complete, roof is nearing completion. So we'll expect to see that update on our web map. And I'm going to run this to the inline querier. So now it detected that changed report. We see there's all the rows that have come in. There's 4 rows on that Excel spreadsheet that have been read in to FME, but we only want to get the latest one. So I'm going to do a query to get by the latest date. I could have also perhaps chosen the highest % complete. So now we only have one record, the latest coming out, that will join to our site. Now I'm going to publish this up to FME Flow. I've already published this, but this just to show you this important step here in the publish. To use SharePoint on FME Flow, you need to make sure you are uploading your web connections and web services. And you also need to upload the package. Now I've already published this, so I'm going to cancel out of that. And we're going to hop over to FME Flow and take a look at those connections over there. So if you haven't seen it before, this is the web application FME Flow, where we're going to create an automation shortly to run our workflow on schedule. Keep those syncs up to date without us having to manually run it. But first, let's take a look at the web connections on FME Flow. So we have 2. We have one for our SharePoint list reader writer, and we'll see that's listed as an OAuth web connection. And if I click on that, we'll see we've got the green check mark, which means it's been authorized in Flow. And the web interface looks like that. It's got an authorize button. But if I click on the token web service I'm using for my Microsoft Graph SharePoint Online Connect, this looks totally different. This is using a tenant ID, client ID, and secret. So that's using the applications as a userless flow. Let's go take a look at the web service underneath it. And I can't even really view the web service on Flow because there's nothing to really view there. However, the SharePoint list reader-writer web service, which is our user flow. This does have some configuration that is needed and is really important to do on Flow. You need to make sure that your client secret and redirect URI are correct for the web connection and service to work on FME Flow. So don't worry, we have all this documented, and we'll share out those links on how to configure that. But I just wanted to show those services and connections on Flow. So now I'm going to open up this automation I built to synchronize SharePoint. There's a lot of different ways to trigger an automation. I'm going to do a schedule trigger, and we're going to repeat this on interval every hour. We're going to kick off our workspace that we've already looked at to do that synchronization for us. So here I've got a workspace action that's running the workspace that's been published to do our change detection and write to ArcGIS Online. Any published parameters I have are going to show up on that action. And that's a super simple automation. If anything fails, we're going to send an email out just saying our synchronization has failed. And we'll include the FME Flow job log with the failure. And in the body of the email, we'll just say it failed at this time, see the job log, and do some investigation. And that action's valid. So let's start the automation. And of course, we don't want to wait an hour for this to run. So I'll just click on the trigger on the schedule trigger and click the trigger button to manually trigger this ad hoc. And we'll have to wait a few seconds here for that workflow to run. But once it has, we should be able to update our web map and see that framing is complete, roof nearing completion update on our Granville Residences site. So let's do that now. It should be done running. Okay, and so now I'm going to click on that Granville Residences point, and we'll see there's our October 16th update. Framing is complete, roof nearing completion. We've got our percent complete has been updated, and our other information. And there's our Oak Ridge Plaza point. If you remember in our list change detection, that's our new point that was detected in the list and has been added to the map. Okay, and that pretty much sums up that first demo of how you can join data in SharePoint with some change detection. So the key points here are that, of course, data can be joined within SharePoint lists and libraries. And you can store a snapshot of a list or library to evaluate what has changed. That's just one way to do it. I could have stored more metadata in ArcGIS Online from my document library and just read it from there as well. But if I wasn't using ArcGIS Online, that might not be an option. We want to let the change detector do the work for us to let us know what's been inserted, updated. It'll also handle deleted. I wasn't using deleted in this flow for time, but you can also, I could improve my workflow to handle those deleted features too. And FME Flow automations can pull SharePoint on schedule. And now I'll pass it over to Natalie to do our next demo.
Okay, so now I'm going to just walk through a quick demo on a fairly simple file move and rename process, where the goal here is to align your file storage and naming convention with your organization's established standards. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide here because I would like to just jump right into the demo for you to show how this works. So let's get that demo started. So here I am back in FME Workbench 2024.1, and I'm going to walk you through a little demonstration on how you can chain several SharePoint Online connectors together to accomplish a file move and rename. So the scenario here is that I am a SharePoint admin, and I was looking through a particular site that I am responsible for managing, and I noticed that one of my users had incorrectly uploaded a couple of files to a document library where they should not have uploaded files to. Okay, so I'll just switch over to that and show you what that looks like. Right now I'm managing 2 project libraries, and each project has a file naming convention that needs to be met. And I noticed that looking at project 41265's library, I noticed there were a couple of files sitting in here that actually belong to project 40782. And I also noticed that those 2 files do not meet the file naming convention that's been established for my organization. Each file should be prefixed with the word project and then the 5-digit project identifier. And these two files don't meet that right now. So what I want to do is I would like to use FME to isolate these two files from project 41265's document library. And I want to move them over to project 40782's document library, and I want to rename them at the same time to meet that file naming standard that's been established. This workspace will accomplish that. This first SharePoint Online connector is going to list the contents of that source drive for 41265, where the documents were incorrectly uploaded to. And then this tester will isolate those two incorrectly uploaded documents from the contents list. This connector right here is actually going to download those two documents from project 41265's document library, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'm just using the download action here, pointing at the source project document library, and I'm going to download this as an attribute. You can download to an intermediary file or folder, but since I just want to directly push this to a different document library, I'm just going to download it as an attribute. Okay, and then this next SharePoint Online connector is where the move and rename happens. So now I'm going to choose the upload action. I'm going to upload the contents of that attribute that's going to be created by the previous online connector for each of those two documents. And then I'm going to point it to my project 40782 document library, where those two files should be sitting. And I'm going to add the project prefix to the name of those files. Then this little workflow right here is just going to verify that upload and rename was successful. As long as that was successful, it'll move on to the cleanup stage. So this workflow up here is going to go back to the source project drive and remove those two incorrectly uploaded files from that document library. So I'll run this piecemeal for you just to show you how things look. I'm going to run to SharePoint Online Connector 3 first to show you the upload and rename. So let that run, and then I'll flip over to the site once that's done running. And that was successful. So let's go look at the site. So there they are. So I'm looking at project 40782's document library, and you just saw them pop into view there. The two files that I moved from project 41265's library are now sitting where they should be sitting, and with the correct file naming convention. So now that I know that my upload was successful, I can move on to the cleanup. So let's run this one and just make sure that's successful. Okay, and now if I refresh 41265's contents, you'll see that those two documents are now gone. Okay, so it's just a basic workflow that you can use to upload and rename SharePoint items as you see fit. Okay, so just quickly, and really the main point to highlight here is the fact that you can chain SharePoint Online connectors together in one workflow to essentially accomplish all of your file migration needs. And then once you have your workflow built and working happily, it's fairly simple to upload it or publish it to your FME Flow instance and create an automation around this SharePoint maintenance activity. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm going to hold off on our HTTP caller demo. However, this demo will be available after the webinar. It will be included with the contents that you can download after the webinar. I'm so sorry. But just as a teaser, the HTTP caller will readily accept access tokens provided by your SharePoint web connections. And it opens up a whole world of Graph API and SharePoint API fun for you. Check out that demo after the webinar. Now on to some troubleshooting tips. And we're going to start with the most common errors you may encounter with these web services and connections. These would be your OAuth 2.0 grant flow errors. So you're going to see these present themselves in a variety of ways: OAuth failed, bad request, invalid redirect URI, invalid audience. And the very first step in troubleshooting these errors is to check your FME web service definition. Under that manage log, go and check your web service definition. Verify your client ID, your tenant ID, client secret, all of those lovely particulars that you had to input. Just go through them again. Make sure they look good as compared to your Azure registered app. And whenever you're in doubt, try creating a new web service from scratch and see if that resolves the issue for you. It can be helpful to get a tool like Wireshark or Fiddler Everywhere if you foresee a lot of API work in your future. These are HTTP traffic monitoring tools that might give you some more details about the errors you're seeing. And sometimes it's as simple as just re-authenticating your web connection. If you start seeing 401 unauthorized errors all of a sudden, try re-authenticating your web connection. Another common one here is managed user consent. This is the scenario where your IT admins have actually disabled the ability for users to grant consent to registered applications. In this case, you actually have to reach out to your IT admin to get them to grant admin consent for you. And once admin consent has been granted, you might have to adjust a very specific portion of your web service definition. You can see it in the image shown bottom on screen with the end prompt parameter. If it's set to consent, you may have to change it to something like select account or login to get away from being prompted to consent to the app. MS-Entra conditional access policies. IT admins can also configure these types of access policies, which may interfere with web service authorization and FME. Device compliance policies are common, where clients must present specific device information which meets required device criteria as outlined in these policies. This type of error will often present itself during your web service or web connection testing. And there's also this other policies called adaptive session lifetime policies. These are essentially just policies which force users to re-authenticate periodically. So if you notice that your web connection stops working every 10 days, every 2 days, if it's consistently a time period, you might be affected by one of these types of policies. Your best bet is to reach out to your IT admin and see if there's any sort of leeway or adjustment that can be made on these policies. But typically these policies are in place for org security reasons, so it's not advisable to try and get around them. And then there's the scenario where you have tested your web service and connection successfully, but you still can't get at your target resources. Often this has to do with permissions, and there are involved in hitting or accessing SharePoint resources. There are user permissions, group permissions, site permissions, item permission. You get the idea. Lots of levels of permissions to check up on. Often the errors have to do with the permissions that have been applied to your Azure registered app, and that would be the first place that I would recommend going for troubleshooting. You can also check if you can readily access your target resource in a web browser. Check if you can readily access the target resource with the HTTP caller. Again, go check out that demo. And check if the SharePoint or Graph API actually has support for the type of resource that you're wanting to access, because not every single resource that can be hosted in SharePoint is necessarily supported by the Graph API. So you want to check up on that too.
Great, and I'll just talk a little bit about some troubleshooting on FME Flow. So one issue a lot of our users will run into is once they publish up to Flow, a connection works for a while and then you start receiving invalid token errors. There's a few reasons for this, but commonly that's because the web service just hasn't been configured on FME Flow yet. So you want to make sure that if you're using an OAuth web service with the auth code Flow, that's the one that's going to show up as a type OAuth in FME Flow, not token. that web service has a client secret, and then the client secret's been created in your Azure app registration, and that you've added your FME flow host / FME OAuth URL to that app registration. And again, we have articles on all that. That has to match what's been entered in FME flow. Just to show you here on the next slide, maybe not the highest resolution here, but you can get an idea. These are the 3 key fields. So the application or client ID, the client secret from the app registration, and the redirect URI. Some users do add the redirect URI, for example, but they'll add it to the mobile or desktop platform in Azure. It has to be added to the web platform. It has to match what's in FME flow. It's really important. All kinds of other errors you can run into if you've been integrating SharePoint and FME before, or even outside of FME, you've probably seen a lot of these errors. To save on time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just know that there's 401 unauthorized errors, forbidden errors. A lot of times the issue is just an improperly configured web service or URLs within the web service that need to be adjusted. There's also timeouts you can get, or 404 not found errors. Always make sure you can get into SharePoint outside of FME. That's pretty important. Check with your networking team. Do they have firewall rules that are preventing the connection? There's also some HTTPS and SSL certificate errors you can hit. You may need to, on FME Flow or FME Form, actually import SSL certificates to establish trust. You'd import those from your SharePoint site, and you may need to delete expired certificates from your operating system certificate store. There might be some invalid intermediary certificates there. So we have this covered in our troubleshooting guide linked below. We also, again, have our Getting Started with SharePoint guide that has all the connections articles, because it's just too much to cover in this webinar. So let's conclude things so we have a little bit of time to address some of the questions that have come in. Just a quick summary. So as we saw here, FME offers several ways to integrate with Microsoft SharePoint: the SharePoint Online connector, the list reader writer, browsing SharePoint as a file system, and also using HTTP callers in the Graph API. That will share that demo that unfortunately we didn't have time to cover. I'll share that after the webinar. FME Flow lets you automate your SharePoint integrations and watch your web service. So determine which canvas objects you'd like to use, the list format, for example, and then configure the correct web service, and be very mindful of that Azure app registration. As Natalie touched on earlier in the troubleshooting, there's a lot of configuration in Azure. One that has caught some users recently are those conditional access policies on the Azure side. So an Azure admin comes in and sets a policy that forces you to reauthorize the connection every day. So there is quite a lot of config there that can affect your FME's ability to integrate reliably with SharePoint. So you want to involve your Azure admin if you're having issues. And yeah, lots of information, including detailed connection instructions, again, in our knowledge base in the articles that we'll share out. And I'll just pass it back to Elizabeth now to conclude things, and we'll have a few minutes for some questions.
Lovely, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'll take us through in a minute or two here so we can get to some questions. But if you are interested in checking out other free resources that we have available, we do have free instructor-led training through our academy. So I'd encourage you to take a look there, and lots of upcoming webinars as well. So we'll highlight those two for now. And we also have podcasts available on demand. So if you're looking for some audio-based learning, maybe on your way to or from work, check those out at EM360. In terms of next steps, we would love to help you get started. Perhaps you have a more in-depth question about how to get started or something with your data related there. Please do contact us, info@safe.com. We'd love to help you out and take a deeper dive. And then in terms of if you are newer to FME, I know there was some folks in that survey, I encourage you to take our FME Accelerator course. It's 90 minutes and free of charge. Claim your community badge. If you're a member of our FME community, as a thank you for joining us today, we do have a code to redeem there. I've just dropped it in the chat. And if you aren't a member of our community, I would encourage you to take a look at that. It takes, I think, maybe 5 or 10 seconds to sign up, and it's a great place to network with other users, as well as get answers to any questions and find solutions there. Our peak of data integration is coming up this next May 6th to 8th, and abstracts submissions are still open until the end of next month. So great opportunity there to apply to present for a special speaker rate included as well. All right, and with that, we've got about 7 minutes here to pick out some questions. I'll get our presenters to turn back on their webcams with me and we can take a look over. Thanks, Bailey, for getting to quite a few as we went through there, as well as the rest of the team.
Yeah, there's some great questions here. So thanks for participating and asking lots of questions, lots of great ones to highlight. There's one here, I was just about to start answering it and then ran out of time there. There's one from Reno. Do you see it there? I don't know how to choose answer live. Sorry, Elizabeth. It's from 818. Oh, there we go. Yeah, the attachment. So I'm not sure if we have an enhancement for that already, Elizabeth, or sorry, Natalie, have you run into that before yet?
So I do know that we have an enhancement filed to have our list format recognize and work with some of the newer like columns, some of the newer field type that you can configure on lists. One of the ones that was specifically mentioned was image. So that may be in the works already, but if it's not, we would certainly love to see that as maybe an idea on the FME community, if that's something that our users would love to see support for.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I haven't seen other requests come in for that, but if that interests other users, yeah, getting an idea on the community so get upvoted, get some traction with the product team. And I think that we can see it's getting upvoted live, so that sounds like there's some interest. I think after the webinar, I can follow up. We'll find the enhancement request Natalie talked about and follow up with the team and see if that's going to include not just the photo attachments, but also any kind of attachment to a list item. Great question. There was another one here. Sorry, I don't want to pick on you there, Reno. I know we've had some calls together about SharePoint. There's another one from 818. It was another good question around, we face a challenge loading SharePoint Online list with many fields. It requires 2 readers. So maybe I'll let you speak to that one a bit, Natalie, because I personally haven't run into that, any kind of limit. I know that there's limits around views and the default view versus show all fields. You don't have other options to pick a view, but I haven't hit any kind of column limit per se, if that's what the intent of that question is.
If there's a consistent, I guess I would say if there's a consistent number of fields where some sort of a timeout or an error is thrown, that would definitely be something we'd want to know about. I don't know of a field limitation or a field count limitation on our format, but I do know that there have been the odd report here and there of something similar with the list format in the past. So we are somewhat aware of it, but it doesn't seem consistent. It's something we could definitely take a look at through a support case or a support ticket and take a deeper look at.
Yeah, for sure. I also just shared in the chat our list reader parameters documentation. So it talks about what can be read in the SharePoint list and the show all fields option. Because there's not that option to pick a different view. You either have the default view or all fields. So it might just be a matter of picking all fields, Reno. But yeah, if you're getting an error, please file a support case. And for anyone who might be getting SharePoint errors that you're unable to resolve, please do file a case and we'll do our best to help resolve those for you.
Looks like we've gotten to most.
Yeah, there's one that was just asked. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Natalie. I keep picking them. You pick one.
No, it's okay. I was just looking at a question that Nick asked about downloading as an attribute. So when you're using the SharePoint Online connector and you choose to download as an attribute, it will behave much the same as any other attribute on your data set will. So it will be more like a cache or a temp download. You won't get anything like a standalone file or anything like that. So yeah, I would say you're on point there with the way you're seeing the way you're seeing that action.
There was one just asked from Ron Lowe. Do you find the OAuth SharePoint fragile? So breaks after Microsoft updates, for example. And does the online connector insulate itself from those updates? Yes and no. One of the items we brought up in our troubleshooting was around SSL certificates. So that's one I know Natalie knows well. And that's one that's just out of our hands, where on a Windows update, it's putting in an expired certificate and breaking that. And there's just not too much we can do about it. You could, as for the other OAuth flow, the rest of the OAuth user flow, yes, there is a fair bit of configuration needed, especially on the Microsoft Azure side, to get it working well. You could look at the new, if you're using the connector, you could look at the new user list flow, which is the application credentials. Technically, it is an OAuth flow as well, but it actually is labeled as a token flow in FME, and that's just passing a client ID and password, or sorry, I should say a client ID and secret, which is essentially a password through, which is going to be a lot, I would say it's going to be less error prone than the full OAuth flow, but it does have the downside of needing to manage that client secret now.
That's great. And yeah, I'll just note and reiterate as well what Natalie said about that HTTP caller demo. We'll have that as a bonus demo content included in our follow-up resources and on the website for you all. Okay, are we all good, team, to wrap up?
I think so, yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just a huge thank you to our team for preparing today's content and all the time you invested in this, as well as Bailey for joining us on the back end for Q&A support this morning. And a huge thank you to our whole audience today for joining